We saw in the last section that really all trig functions can be defined based on their values between 0 and pi over 2. Well, what that allows us to do then is we can now find the value of any trig function for any theta based on what's called a reference angle. I've given you a picture here to show you that if the angle is less than 90 degrees or less than pi over 2 radians, then the angle equals the reference angle that we'll use to calculate the trigonometric functions. If the theta value takes us into the second quadrant, then we simply define that reference angle to be the angle difference between pi and the original theta. For an angle that takes us into the third quadrant, it'll be the reference angle between the angle and the x-axis. And then for one that takes us into fourth quadrant, it will be this reference angle. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at one. If I want to find the reference angle for 9 pi over 8, I think it's very helpful to draw a picture. Notice that this translates into pi, which brings us to here, and then an additional angle of pi over 8. So our reference angle, theta prime, is going to be pi over 8. We can then do our calculations for the trigonometric function, sine, cosine, tangent, etc., based just on pi over 8. Likewise, suppose we were dealing with phi equals negative 655 degrees. Again, that indicates that we're going in the clockwise direction. So we would travel around multiple times and then come back, and our reference angle would be right here. If you subtract the 360s that you need, it leaves us with a value of 65 degrees for our reference angle. These reference angles can then be used to make the calculations for sine and cosine, but what you have to remember is the sign changes. And what you can remember if you look at the quadrants is all students take calculus. And what that helps you remember is all the trig functions are positive in the first quadrant. Sine is positive in the second quadrant, which also indicates that cosecant will be positive there. Tangent and likewise cotangent will be positive in the third quadrant. And then cosine and secant will be positive in the fourth quadrant. Again, you would just take the reference angle, whatever it is, make the calculations, and then change the sign accordingly to the quadrant that it is in. So let's do one of these calculations. Let's calculate the cosine of 4 pi over 3. If we go to our coordinate plane here, here's pi, and then we have pi over 3. We know from our relationships of triangles, if this is pi over 3, then this is going to be pi over 6. We can set up our relationships then. Our ratios tell us that this side represents 1, 2 for hypotenuse, and square root of 3. We know that cosine of theta, in this case, we're looking at the reference angle of pi over 3, is adjacent over hypotenuse, which leads us to 1 over 2. And then what we have to do is look at what quadrant we're in. We're in the third quadrant. Only tangent and cotangent will be positive. So the cosine is going to be -1/2.